What is the best argument for God? Basically, premise 1 states that God would just be some kind of necessary precondition for knowledge, morality, logic, etc.
Yo, can this guy just shut up? Here's a 3-part guide to the actual best arguments for God. This part will go into the foundations of Bayesian probability and why we are more justified in believing the hypothesis that better predicts the data. First, what is probability? Well, probability is a function that assigns a number between 0 and 1 to an event, representing its likelihood. For a Bayesian specifically, these probabilities are interpreted as the degree of belief, also called a credence, you have in a given event occurring. To truly understand the Bayesian formulations of arguments, you'll have to know how to read probability notation, so here's the basic symbols. The only confusing one here is conditional probability, which would just be the probability that A is true if B is true. Another thing is this. On the top, you see the definition of what conditional probability is. It's just the probability of A and B being divided by the probability of A itself. From here, you can multiply both sides by the probability of A and get the equation on the bottom. We'll call this bottom equation the product rule. With the probability out of the way, now we'll go into what Bayesianism is and how Bayesian epistemology works. In short, a Bayesian is someone who holds that probabilities represent degrees of rational belief, and that rational agents should update those beliefs according to Bayes' theorem when they receive evidence. But this leaves 2 questions open. Why should I care about the probabilities, and what even is Bayes' theorem? For people who don't find the first question to be self-evident, there's a famous series of arguments called the Dutch book arguments, which show that if you have credences that violate the laws of probability, and you're willing to place bets based off those credences, then it's possible for someone to offer you a series of bets that you'd accept in, which would be guaranteed to lose money overall. But honestly, the Dutch book arguments are far too nuanced to go into within the scope of this video, and I'm just a little too lazy to do them, so we'll just do them another time. As for the second question, now that we've learned the product rule and some basic math, we can derive Bayes' theorem. For this, H stands for hypothesis and E stands for evidence. One last thing that's important to note before we start is that the probability of H is the prior probability of the hypothesis before updating on evidence. Now that we understand the equation, it's easy to see how some theories get a higher probability boost if they predict the data better. Here's an example. Imagine that a patient tests positive for COVID. On the hypothesis that the patient has COVID, the probability of the hypothesis given the evidence is high due to the fact that the probability of the evidence given the hypothesis is high and the probability of the evidence is low. On the other hand, hypothesis 2, the hypothesis that the patient does not have COVID, poorly predicts the data. So here, the probability of the hypothesis given the evidence actually goes down. But now one issue remains. How do we determine the prior probability of a hypothesis? Well, here's where a massive distinction needs to be made. There are actually 2 types of Bayesians, subjective Bayesians and objective Bayesians. The distinction is that subjective Bayesians will say almost any prior probability will be valid, while objective Bayesians will say that there are objective constraints to your priors. Usually, objective Bayesians in philosophy either state that we determine priors off of the various theoretical virtues or with a form of the principle of indifference. And the version of the principle of indifference that most philosophers use just says that we should assign equal probabilities to states that have no rationally relevant difference. However, unless the interlocutor has infinitesimally small priors, either view should work for the arguments I'm going to propose in the next video. And that's all. In the next 2 videos, I'll go over the 2 arguments that this formulation uses, which is the argument from psychophysical harmony and various formulations of fine-tuning. If this video helped, be sure to interact with it so I could get more of a following and be able to post. And everyone, please stop using tag.